Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Julia Linke, and I'm the science coordinator for the Boreal Ecosystem Recovery and Assessment Project, or in short, BERA. I will be the host of this webinar today, and I will be recording this meeting so that we can later post it on our website. And I want to start by thanking you all for joining this final synthesis webinar. The goal for this 2-hour webinar is to present to you the highlights of the insights gained over the past 5 years of this BERA research team. I would first like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gathered that was originally planned to be on Treaty 7 territory before the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. So now we're joining in from all over Alberta and beyond, and we'd like to acknowledge, therefore, that we are meeting on Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territory, and all the First Nations and Métis and Inuit people who have lived, traveled, and gathered on these lands for thousands of years. We would like to welcome all of you who are not only attending from a vast range of locations, but also a vast range of organizations. And I would like to, instead of going through 100 individual participants, which I would normally like to do in a real workshop, give you an opportunity to identify yourselves, present yourselves a little bit, introduce yourself. I'm just going to read all the organizations that you are from. So we have today members from the Alberta Provincial Government, Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, Alberta Data Partnership, Alberta Energy Regulator, Alberta Innovates, Alberta Pacific Forest Industries, Alberta Wilderness Association, Athabasca Oil Corporation, Athabasca University, ATCO Electric, Canadian Association of Geophysical Contractors, the Canadian Forest Service and NRCan, Canadian Sphagnum Peat Moss Association, Cenovus Energy, China National Offshore Oil Corporation, CPAWS Northern Alberta, ConocoPhillips Canada, COSIA, the David Suzuki Foundation, Environment and Climate Change Government of Canada, the Foothills Research Institute, Fuse Consulting, Imperial Oil, Lauren Group, Meg Energy, NATE, OGL Engineering, University of Alberta, University of Calgary, University of Lethbridge, University of Waterloo, Southern Illinois University, Suncor Energy, Trent University, and Woodlands North. So we are excited to see so many of you here today interested to hear about our BERA work. And we want to thank, in particular, also our partners, NSERC, Alberta Pacific Forest Industries, Cenovus, Canadian Natural, and ConocoPhillips, whose generous support over the last few years has really made possible all of the work we've been doing. And I also want to acknowledge our many collaborators that we've had on this project. Anne McIntosh from U of A, Jahan Karayeva from ABMI, Brendan Birdsell from OGL, Shane Patterson from the Alberta government, Rob Soroya from RIC, Todd Shipman from AER, Matthias Schubert and Ralf Ludwig from Ludwig-Maximilian University in Munich, Germany. So that's a lot of acknowledgements, a lot of people, but we really do appreciate all of you being here. And we're very excited to be able to hold this sort of overarching highlights synthesis today and present it to you. Would have preferred to do it in a one-day full workshop, but I think this is the best medium we have in this moment, and we hope to see you in person at some other time. And with this, without further ado, I would like to give over to Greg McDermott, the Principal Investigator of BERA, to give you an introduction to BERA. Greg, please.
Okay. Hello, everybody. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all, because the dirty little secret about Zoom and PowerPoint is that when you start a PowerPoint presentation, you suddenly can't see anything. So good to see you all today from your physically distant locations. What have we got? We've got people in the wilderness, we got people in basements, we got people in offices. I'm looking for David Roberts because he told me he might even change out of his pajamas this morning, but I can't seem to find him. Anyway, good to see you all. So like Julia said, this webinar marks the end of BERA's initial 5-year research grant, and I wanted to echo Julia's expression of gratitude to our partners and our collaborators and other interested stakeholders, like all of you who took the time to attend here today. I have to say that this is a much different event than the one that we had initially planned. We had arranged for a full-day workshop at the University of Calgary, filled with comfortable research talks and interactive sessions and plenary discussions. But after COVID, we decided that it just wasn't feasible to try and replicate that kind of event online. I mean, people are at home in distracted environments, and the medium that we have here is just not conducive to full-day meetings. So instead, we decided to do a webinar and limit it to 2 hours in order to respect the situation that I know everyone finds themselves in. Now, I must say that this puts the presenters at a bit of a disadvantage. We're pretty good at holding workshops, but webinars are a different beast. None of us have a lot of experience with this format, and in order to keep things to within 2 hours, we really had to cut a lot of activities and trim the presentations way, way down. So for example, you're soon going to see all of us co-PIs attempt the impossible task of showing off highlights of a 5-year research program in teeny tiny little 15-minute sessions, one per team. I guarantee you that every one of us would rather fill the whole 2 hours on our own, because 50 minutes is very, very difficult. So what that means is that you're going to have to bear with us a little bit here. We all have a tendency to try and do too much and speak too quickly, make mistakes with terminology and these sorts of things, oversimplify complex issues. We'll try and do our best, but this is sort of what we're dealing with. Okay, I'm now going to start sharing my screen again, and we can begin. Okay, so BERA, one of my jobs here this morning is to introduce you a little bit to the project and sort of provide an overview on the research questions that have been guiding us for the past 5 years. So this is what we're going to try and accomplish specifically in the webinar today. BERA is organized into 5 research teams. So the first thing we're going to do is give you some highlights from each of the 5 themes. And the co-PIs are going to help me out with each of these tasks. After that, what we want to do is give everyone an opportunity to ask some questions and interact with the researchers that we have here. And if there's time at the end, I'll give you a very brief summary of the BERA activities and achievements from the past 5 years. Now, before we begin, I'd like to take a little time to introduce our project a little bit more formally. And in doing so, I kind of want to give you a sense of place in the environment that we've been working in for the past 5 years. So this is a Google Earth image of one of BERA's main research sites, Kirby. You'll hear that name several times today, I'm sure, near the town of Conklin. Now, you can see in the image that this is a pretty busy landscape. A lot of the features you see are caused by industrial activity related to resource extraction. I'll point out a few of these features. I see some roads out there. I see some well sites out there associated with exploration. I see some well pads with equipment on them. I see some forest harvest areas. I see some pipelines, and I see some seismic lines of various vintages and sizes. So all of this footprint is physical footprint that you can see in an image. But more important than seeing it, this footprint has a functional effect on this ecosystem. Actually, it has many functional effects on the ecosystem. Probably the most widely publicized of these effects is on woodland caribou. So human footprint features like the ones that we've seen open up the landscape to other primary prey types like deer, which in turn boosts predator numbers. And this apparent competition is causing the decline of caribou populations throughout northern Alberta, or at least contributing to the decline. Now, it's not just caribou. A couple of years ago, Fisher and Burton published a paper that showed that disturbances in the oil sand region have shifted the populations of entire communities of mammals within this area. And there are winners like deer, and there are losers like black bear and red fox. Another paper last year by Lisa Mahon and colleagues showed that this same kind of thing is happening with birds. All of this is complicated even further by the fact that wildlife is not the only thing to be concerned with. BERA co-PI Maria Strack has been instrumental in showing that industrial disturbances also offer carbon dynamics in the boreal forest. And this is concerning because peatland in Alberta represents this huge natural store of carbon that we would like to keep in the ground. So BERA overall has got this big guiding question. When is human footprint in the boreal forest no longer footprint? Now, it seems like a really simple question, but it's extraordinarily complex, because what you're really asking is, when is footprint restored? Now, what you have to recognize is that the physical footprint is different than its functional effects. And when we talk about restoration, we're speaking of the function, not the physical thing. So any given restoration action you do that's designed to reduce footprint could have multiple functional responses, some positive and some negative. So for example, we could apply a silvicultural treatment like scarification and mounding to improve things for trees, and it might have other unintended consequences. So this is very complicated. Now, if you want to restore footprint, what you need to do is look at things through the lens of a particular management goal. And in BERA, these goals are informed by our industrial partners. So current policy or current priorities include promoting return to forest cover in disturbed areas, restoring natural carbon dynamics in disturbed peatlands, enhancing woodland caribou habitat, and ensuring that wildlife populations and behaviors are within the natural range of variability. So in BERA, we have all these little key research questions that guide our individual research projects, and I'll summarize just some of them for you here. First of all, we want to know, where is the footprint? And I don't just mean broadly where the footprint, I mean exactly where is the footprint? What vegetation is growing there? And can we measure this vegetation and track changes through time? Now, this is the domain of the research team. We're guided by these main research questions, and that work is taking place at the University of Calgary, Trent University, and the Canadian Forest Service in Edmonton. We also want to know, how do these industrial disturbances affect soil and hydrological conditions? And how is this related to ecosystem function? These are the domain of the Soils and Ecohydrology team, which is guided by Maria Strack at the University of Waterloo. What factors affect vegetation regeneration and recovery? And can we estimate future recovery trajectories? These are the questions addressed by Scott Nielsen and his team at the University of Alberta, the vegetation team. How do wildlife species use disturbance features at different stages of recovery? And what are the cumulative effects of industrial activity on wildlife? This is the domain of the wildlife team, headed up by Aaron Bain at the University of Alberta. Now, one of the things that distinguishes BERA is that we've always tried to leverage new technology, be it LiDAR and drones in the remote sensing group or acoustic recording units on the wildlife team. Now, along this line, we kind of had this dream of deploying large networks of low-cost sensors in the boreal forest to assist researchers and managers who work there. Now, as you probably know, all everyday objects these days are networked and online, from your phone to your refrigerator, and the same is true of environmental sensors. So all of this is kind of known as the Internet of Things, and so the IoT team set out to try and develop such a system for environmental monitoring. Okay, I want to take a few seconds to introduce the team a little bit more formally. We have the remote sensing co-PI, Stephen Franklin from Trent, Guillermo Castillo from Canadian Forest Service in Edmonton, and myself from the University of Calgary. We have Maria Strack, who's the PI or co-PI of the Soils and Ecohydrology team at the University of Waterloo. We have Scott Nielsen from the University of Alberta working on vegetation, And we have Aaron Bain from the University of Alberta working on wildlife. Then we have Steve Liang from the University of Calgary working on the IoT. Now, there's a whole host of other characters that I'm not going to be able to introduce formally, but these are the graduate students, researchers, and other affiliated people who are helping do all of this work. Okay, in case you're interested in how BERA functions, this is how it's like. We are an industrial research partnership funded by a collaborative research and development grant from the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. So our industrial partners are on the left and some other partners who contribute, and we all put together the funding to do the work at the various institutions. Here is the program at a glance. Hopefully it's not too far past 9:20 because I'm pretty much done with welcome and introduction. We're now going to move into this series of synthesis research findings led by each of the co-investigators. So this will take a little over an hour to get through. And remember, this is the part where you're going to need to use the chat window to pass on any questions or comments you might have to Julia. After that, we're going to take some time for some comments and feedback. This is the part where you can raise your digital hand and Julia will unmute you. And we'll run that right until 10 o'clock. I'll maybe take a few minutes to sort of summarize things. And then we'll officially end things as close to 11 o'clock as we can. Now, if you want to stick around though, because I know that a lot of this is going to be quite stunted, the PIs will be staying online past 11 o'clock, and you're welcome to stay with us and continue the discussion. Okay, now, as I warned you at the beginning, the PIs are really only going to be able to scratch the surface of what we've accomplished over the last 5 years, and the rest of it, you're going to need to turn to your project summary. So in your package yesterday, Julia will have sent you 45 of these project summaries. This is what they look like. They're short little summaries of individual BERA project with a focus on management implications and lessons learned. And like I said, there's 44 of them, so enjoy your reading. Okay, with that, I'll pass things back to Julia.
Thank you, Greg, for this introduction. I don't think there's any questions at this stage. So again, I think I'm going to pass it right back to you, Greg, because you are actually the presenter for the remote sensing team. So we're now moving into the research synthesis highlights. So these short 15-minute overviews of what has been carried out over the last 5 years. As Greg said, people will only be able to scratch the surface, but I hope you will stay around at the end to engage more after 11 o'clock, if you can make it. But Greg, please take the floor for the remote sensing team presentation.
Okay, well, I warned you, it's no longer just me anymore, it's me and my puppy. Okay, share my screen again. Okay, is everything good, Julia?
Yes, all good.
Okay. So I am going to be presenting on behalf of the remote sensing team, and I'll just remind you about our guiding research questions. Where is the footprint? What vegetation is growing here? And can we measure vegetation on disturbances and track changes through time? Again, I'm presenting on behalf of a pretty sizable group of people here. Outside of the PI team, which I've already introduced, I want to acknowledge the students and postdocs and other researchers who performed most of this work. And I'm really sorry that I'm hardly able to present any of it, but I will do some. What I decided to do was present some research in context of a bit of a story related to a particular type of human footprint in the boreal forest and the restoration efforts that are going on around it. And that footprint is seismic lines. So seismic lines are petroleum exploration corridors. This sort of activity has been going on in the province for a long time, since the 1940s. And so the practice and technology has changed a lot over that time. Most of the early seismic lines, like these ones on the right, were cut by bulldozers. We call these conventional seismic lines, and they're about 8 to 10 meters wide. Since about the mid-1990s, We've primarily turned to mulchers to cut these low impact lines, narrower and more windy, that are about 2 to 5 meters wide. Now, the thing about seismic lines is that the physical disturbance can persist on the landscape for a really long period of time. Now, I don't want to suggest that all seismic lines look like this, but there was a pretty influential study a few years ago by Phil Lee and Stan Boutens that surveyed some of these conventional seismic lines and found that after 35 years, just 8% had recovered to greater than 50% cover of woody vegetation, and none of them in the wetland sites had recovered woody vegetation. Now, again, I'm not trying to suggest that woody vegetation is the only indication of recovery, but the fact is that we have a lot of seismic lines out there in a state of arrested succession. And what we're trying to do is figure out why that is and what we can do about it. So in 2017, the government released a provincial restoration framework for legacy seismic lines in Alberta. And these guidelines are designed primarily to assist caribou by encouraging return to forest cover and limiting human and predator movement on the landscape. So what does seismic line restoration efforts have to do with remote sensing? Well, what this document did was provide a bit of a practical guide to guide the targets for our research group. Now, there are quite a few targets that we worked on. I only have time for 3 of them. I'll quickly go through line delineation and attribution, feeding detection and stalking, and then coarse woody debris. And so what we're setting up to do here is develop remote sensing knowledge and tools that help maximize limited restoration dollars that will be aimed at seismic lines. This is important because there are a lot of seismic lines out there, over 1 million kilometers in Alberta. So anything we can do to maximize efficiencies is going to be beneficial. Okay, so the first target, line delineation and attribution. So we're super lucky in Alberta to have this really great publicly available data set on human footprint features produced by the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. And that database includes seismic lines. Now, these seismic lines are painstakingly detailed by people working in front of a computer, looking at imagery at a scale of about 1 to 5,000, if I'm not mistaken. And this data set works great for most applications. But if you look closely, you'll notice 2 things. First of all, there are minor spatial inconsistencies between the digitized lines, which are here as dashed, and the real physical feature on the ground, which you can see underneath. So this scene shows a dense grid of 3D lines with the ADMI layer on top of it. Now, these minor offsets suddenly become important if you're trying to do really detailed work like seismic line restoration. The second thing is that these hand digitized lines have limited attributes. So for example, you would not be able to use that database to distinguish things like a line with little vegetation growing on it that might benefit from restoration treatment from a line with lots of recovery happening, vegetation recovery, that you might decide to leave for natural. Now, please don't take any of this as a criticism of ADMI or any particular data set. I love that group. Plus, the idea of how to enhance these layers, which I'm about to show you, came directly from them. Okay, so the forest line mapper. This is primarily the work of Gus Lopez in our group. This is a tool designed for enhanced delineation and attribution of linear disturbances in forests. If you were part of the working group that assisted with this, you'll be amused to know that it's no longer the seismic line mapper, it's the forest line mapper because it does more than just seismic lines. I need to get Gus to change the BitHub page because it still says seismic line mapper there. Here's how the tool works. Let's say you wanted to run it on this little patch of forest here. Then you need 2 main inputs. The first thing you need is a canopy height model raster, preferably derived from LiDAR. The second thing is you're going to need some regional scale polylines, digitized at about 1 to 5,000 to 1 to 20,000, like the ABMI layer, for example. Now you can see the slight mismatches here in the image, but that's not going to matter. We get 2 main outputs. The first are sort of LiDAR corrected center lines that more closely match what's happening on the ground, and then polygon footprints, which very carefully delineate the physical extent of the footprint. After those things are extracted, the forest line mapper also extracts a whole bunch of useful metrics, which I don't have time to go through, but there is quite a lot of things that we derive from the canopy height model. So what this tool basically does is takes an existing inventory or seed points that you provide that were digitized at like roughly 1 to 20,000 and turns them into a really detailed lines and extents like you would digitize at 1 to 500. But you don't have to do that because the machine does it for you. And this is multi-processing, so you can process large areas like Kirby here, which is the same scene that I showed you back in the introduction. So not only do you see all the lines carefully delineated, but there's now a wealth of attributes. So for example, this is showing all of the perimeter area ratios of lines in and around Kirby. So the cool colors are narrower, more complex lines, where the warm colors are wider and simpler lines. Okay, so to summarize, the forest line mapper maps linear just features quickly and efficiently over large areas. It's this free tool, open source software, and it's distributed through GitHub if you'd like to have a look at it or contribute to it. A peer-reviewed journal article is circulating internally right now and will be out soon. We actually did a bunch of experiments on the accuracy of the forest line mapper and our manuscript reports on all of those things, so I won't go through them today. Okay, the second target I want to talk to you briefly about is conifer seedling detection and stocking. So if you go back to the provincial restoration criteria, you'll remember that it was designed primarily to assist caribou. So a lot of the treatments that they recommend include tree planting and silviculture designed to encourage a return to forest cover. Now, if you plant trees on a site, then the criteria will call for 2 rounds of establishment monitoring. One called the survivability assessment at 2 to 5 years, and a second one at 8 to 10 years called the establishment survey. So we want to know, can remote sensing detect conifer seedlings on seismic lines so that we could assist with this type of monitoring? The answer, of course, is yes. Of course we can do it. Corey FedEx showed early on within BERA that if you take a drone and you hover over regenerating seedlings on a cut block, like the little green things here that you can barely see, then what we can do is we can process that image. We can pull those things out with some pretty straightforward processing and get reasonable accuracies around 70%. Now, we did this on super small seedlings, but of course, the problem is that we're not going to be able to fly drones everywhere. There's too many lines. So this is not really an operational technology right now. And so the question is rather, can remote sensing do it? What we should say is, under what conditions can remote sensing detect conifer seedlings on an operational basis? And that's what I'll talk to you about here today. So we did a series of experiments using an automated classification algorithm to detect surveys or detect seedlings that we surveyed in the field. It's a pretty straightforward algorithm, so I'm sure it could be improved, but it should work everywhere. And we ran this on imagery with pixel sizes range from 5 centimeters to 30 centimeters. 30 centimeters being roughly the resolution you would get from a normal AVI flight, and 5 centimeters being fairly close to the limit of what you can get from a commercial vendor. You could probably get a little better than that, but we worked with 5 centimeters. Now, we performed this analysis under leaf-on conditions in the summer and leaf-off conditions in the spring, because we wanted to document the effect of seasonality on the results. And we set out thinking that this was probably going to work best in leaf-off conditions, where there's like spectral distinction between evergreen seedlings and the background, which is Senac. So this figure summarizes the results of our 5 centimeter data. So you can see generally that it's seedling height, which is on the x-axis here. As it increases, then our detectability rate also goes up. So as you would expect, our detectability rate is tightly linked to seedling size. Well, the other thing you'll see in the graphic is that we have a problem with deciduous conifers like tamarack. The top line is all conifer seedlings, I should say all evergreen conifer seedlings, and the bottom line is all conifer seedlings. So if we take tamarack out of the mix, we do better because, of course, tamarack seedlings are hard to see in the spring because they have no needles on them and they just blend into the background. So generally speaking, we require pixels of 5 centimeters or better in order to establish 60 or plus centimeter tall seedlings, which is about what we would expect at the establishment survey stage with reasonable accuracy. If you want to do very small survival assessment seedlings, we would require pixel sizes smaller than 1 centimeter, and I don't think this is operationally feasible at the moment, not until we can fly drones up and down lines beyond visual line of sight with you know, some sort of solar panel on the top or something. Now, I would really love to tell you about Michelle Diliatro's work right now on estimating seedling height with drone imagery using a new technique called structure from motion photogrammetry. It produces these really cool, highly dense 3D models. You can see the little batch of seedlings here on the left, and then some different 3D photogrammetric models on the right at different resolutions, because we sort of have this vision. If we can find the seedlings with automated detection, we can then use photogrammetry to measure seedlings, which is another thing that needs to be done for the restoration criteria. But sorry, Michelle, I don't have a lot of time here. Okay, the second target I want to talk to you about is coarse woody debris. Woody debris, of course, is dead wood, either intact or partially decomposed, and the coarse stuff is just the big stuff. There's also fine woody debris out there, and the distinction kind of depends on where you go. Coarse woody debris creates microsites for vegetation establishment and protection for seedlings, and so we can find this as an important element of the criteria. It also creates human barriers when we stack it on the lines in high enough volume. So we wanted to know, can visible coarse woody debris be detected accurately with aerial data on an operational basis? And can we then take these visible coarse woody debris and develop good models of actual complete coarse woody debris volume as you might measure on the ground? I'm going quickly here, but here's a little image of 5 centimeter data over Kirby. If you look closely, you can see little piles of coarse woody debris in there, and we essentially use object-based machine learning algorithms on optical data and LiDAR data to pull out all of the coarse woody debris. Now, we did some models in a calibration area in Kirby, and then we tested them in a spatially distinct validation area to sort of quantify our accuracy levels. I'm not going to go through this in much detail, but basically our detection accuracy was really very good. In the calibration area, especially because that's where we train them, and even when we go down to the verification area, we still have accuracies above 80 and 90%. We do better when we don't try and distinguish logs from snags. If we only care about coarse woody debris, then we can do this really accurately. Snags are standing coarse woody debris, logs are fallen coarse woody debris, in case I forgot to mention that. If we introduce LiDAR into the mix, then we do even better, about 6% better than if we do not use LiDAR, especially for trying to distinguish between logs and snags. We then took this data and applied it to other models to predict full volumetric coarse woody debris estimates across the entire study area. And again, these models are very good with R squareds in the 0.6 to 0.7 range, and they are improved if we also include multispectral LiDAR. So this is the kind of map our model will produce. Again, this is Kirby, and the cool colors represent low amounts of coarse woody debris volume, and the warm colors represent high amounts. And if you look closely, it's kind of cool. I know we don't have the time here, but we can see, you know, some piles of coarse woody debris on some of the seismic lines that were probably placed, but for restoration purposes, we can see some wind throws here and there. Anyway, it's a cool map. We can also take that map and run it through the forest line mapper. And what we'll do is it'll summarize that attribute on the line. So now we can look and see which lines have low amounts of coarse-weight debris volume, which lines have high amounts of coarse-weight debris volume. By the way, the forest line mapper will summarize any raster surface you give it in a similar way, so you don't need to do this with just coarse-weight debris. You can do it with anything your team generates. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here and summarize. So first of all, in terms of mapping footprint, we've got this free open source software tool called the Forest Line Mapper. It maps any type of linear disturbance in forests. It essentially takes your kind of coarser inventory of lines and churns out very detailed inventory of lines and extents. And then it produces a large number of additional attributes using the input canopy height model and any other user supplied raster layer that you give it. In terms of detecting seedlings, we use leaf-off imagery with 5 centimeter pixels are going to be required for any sort of establishment survey with conifer seedlings. Deciduous conifers like tamarack are a problem, although we have not tested the fall season where they might be more spectrally distinct. And remote survivability assessments are not operationally feasible using the methods we tested, but the establishment surveys are more promising. Coarse-weight debris can be detected and mapped very effectively over large areas. Airborne optical imagery works great, and it's even better if you throw some LiDAR in the mix. So I will stop here and pass it back to Julia.
Thank you, Greg. You are at your limit of the time. I might just look at one question here, but very briefly only, and then we really need to move over to Maria.
Sorry, Maria.
So there's one question about the Forest Line Mapper. Does the Forest Line Mapper have data throughout Alberta? So I think that requires just one.
Sure. Yeah. So the Forest Line Mapper is a tool. It's not a data set. So essentially what it does, it's a software tool that works with ArcGIS, and you give it the two inputs, the coarsely delineated lines and then some sort of canopy height model, and then it will churn out the data that you're probably looking for.
Thank you, Greg. That's just, yeah, thank you for the clarification. But we will take more questions on content in the open discussion section. So thank you very much, Greg. Wow. I will, let's move over then to Maria Strack, please, to the Soils and Ecohydrology Research Synthesis talk. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Julia. And it's great to be here today. I'm in a bit of an envious position in that our team joined the project a little bit later, so I have slightly less to summarize, which hopefully will mean that I can keep myself on time, but also I have a little bit less time. And so I've just got the key questions here, but I'd like to move right away to, as Greg said, you know, none of this would be possible without the excellent trainees that we have. And so I just wanted to introduce our team here. Some of the work I'm going to be showing you today is from the research, the PhD research of Percy Corsa, which is still ongoing, postdoc work of Scott Davidson, and also the ongoing master's research of Kimberly Kleinke. And if I do run out of time, or if you don't have all your questions answered over the webinar today, feel free to reach out to us either over social media, which I've put here, our Twitter handle, or email me directly. So, you know, why did we sort of add the soils and hydrology into the BERA program sort of as it was going on, and in a program where Greg has sort of highlighted the initial questions were really maybe more about where the footprint is and when is the footprint no longer a footprint. Well, I think that we can learn a lot about looking at changes in hydrology and soils, first of all, as they are an important part of what potentially the impacts of that footprint are. Because we want to just understand the full effects of the disturbance on these ecosystem services, one of which in the boreal is really important is climate regulation because of the large amount of carbon that's stored in the soils, as well as having abundant peatlands in the region that are exchanging greenhouse gases. Secondly, understanding these soil and hydrologic conditions that may be changing on the lines could be really important for reaching this goal of forest recovery, because these present potential barriers to that forest recovery. And in particularly, we might think about things like changes to soil moisture and nutrient availability. And if those are identified as important barriers, then by monitoring those as we go through reclamation program, we'll be able to assess the effectiveness of our reclamation activities for overcoming those barriers. And so I just wanted to take a minute here to talk a little bit about mounding, which Greg has introduced some of the reclamation activities that do go on these sites. But thinking specifically about mounding, I'm going to talk a lot today about more of the sort of lowland or peatland ecosystems. And while there's a range of different silvicultural practices that are applied in reclaiming these disturbances, this is one that's widely used on these lowland wet ecosites. And so Scott Nielsen will talk a little bit more about what we see actually happening on these lines, but in general, we have this sort of simplification of the ground surface. And so that if that is too wet for trees to establish, then we might aim to try to create these drier microsites where the soil conditions will be more appropriate for establishment and growth of those tree seedlings. And so the idea here is that we create these mounds that are then higher, drier ecosites, moving from a system like this to a system like the photo on the right. And I also wanted to show you what this looks like operationally, because as this is often applied, you basically are using an excavator to dig out some of that soil and flip it up to make this mound. And this can result in a lot of soil mixing, and you may be exposing some deeper soil so that the soil on the surface of these mounds could be very different than what the soil on the surface of the line was before you did that. So what I want to do now is sort of give you a summary of some of the main findings that we've found so far on some of these projects that we've done. And so the first thing that I think we can say very clearly, and probably that we've known for a while, but we maybe haven't had extensive data sets to quantify this, is that soils on seismic lines are compacted and have higher soil moisture than the adjacent undisturbed forest. And so if we start with the graph on the left here, this is some of the work of Scott Davidson, who sampled along both wide, or what Greg described as conventional lines, as well as narrow, so more of these low impact lines, on the line and then into the adjacent reference ecosystem. And the compaction could be illustrated by the bulk density. So if you have more compaction, you're going to have a denser soil. And so what we see is that on both the wide and the narrow lines, we have an increase in that compaction on the line compared to even the edge of the line and then into the adjacent forest. And this results in higher moisture content because you've basically brought that surface of the soil, you've compacted it and brought it closer to the water table position. So that you have now wetter soils, particularly on those wider lines compared to the adjacent reference ecosystem. And this is some data from a site near Fort McMurray, but we now are measuring this across many different areas of the province. And so some of the research of Percy Corsa is also showing this in a series of different peatland sites near Peace River, that again, we see this consistently higher moisture content on the line compared to the adjacent natural ecosystem. And so one of the goals in mounding then would to be create these drier conditions. And so we do know that, we do see that mounding results in drier conditions, but often the soils are actually even more compacted. So again, if we look at some of the work of Scott Davidson, here he's looked at undisturbed ecosystems, the unmounded lines, and then compared them to lines where there's mounding, always looking at the high position. So this would be the created mound or else a natural high position in the landscape, and then the low. And so if we look at volumetric water content, you do see that those high positions are always drier, and the mounds maybe the mounds are drier, but they remain slightly wetter still than the high positions in the reference ecosystem. And that bulk density of all the sites we measure is consistently higher on those mounds. This is from the Kirby site, and at first we weren't sure if maybe this was a site-specific result, but now that Kim is starting to do some work at sites near Cold Lake, we're actually seeing the same pattern. So first looking at volumetric water content, and here we have an undisturbed site compared to an unmounded or an untreated line, and then lines mounded at different sites at different times in the past. And what you do see again is that drop, those drier conditions on the mounds, but that they do tend to remain wetter or moister than the natural high positions. And again, consistently the highest bulk density or the most compacted soil on those mounds. And this is likely the reason that they do maintain that higher soil moisture content, is that this compacted soil is better at holding onto moisture, and that allows it to maintain that higher moisture content. As we mix up that soil during the initial disturbance, this can enhance the turnover or the mineralization and decomposition of the soil organic matter. What this means is that we're losing carbon from these soils and that it's being emitted to the atmosphere. This is probably not surprising. It's the same type of a process that we might see in an agricultural system where we till the soil and it releases some of the organic material in the soil. But again, we didn't really have data to illustrate this. So if we look at a site where we have just maybe a shallow organic layer at the surface, we can see this very clearly, that we have this large reduction in soil organic matter, both on the wider conventional and the narrow lines, of about 30 to 40%. And this is in the near surface soil. It's much more difficult for us to measure this when we're in a peatland ecosystem. So this site here on the right, because the entire profile is really organic material. So even if we've lost some soil carbon, it'll be difficult for us to detect that. Nonetheless, we still see on both the unmounded lines and maybe slightly greater on the mounded lines, a small decline in that soil organic matter content. So another way to look at that on these systems that are really organic rich is to look at the change in the isotopic composition of that organic material. And in this case, as you increase that isotopic composition, or you get heavier signatures, this would be indicative of greater mineralization, or that you have had more decomposition happen over time. So this is going back to those sites where you have the reference ecosystem and then the unmounded and mounded line. And what you see is a consistent increase in those signatures as you move through that sort of pattern of management, with the highest values on the mounds. So what this does suggest is that potentially you've had the most mineralization, the most carbon loss in the mounds. And this is raising the question about whether we might be facing a trade-off between creating these mounds in order to encourage tree regeneration, but potentially enhancing soil decomposition and then carbon loss from the soils. And this is something we think is really important to keep monitoring into the future and on more sites, and potentially linking to contemporary rates of carbon exchange. As we have this mineralization occurring, not only are we releasing carbon from that organic material, but also nutrients. And the way in which plants and different plant species are able to access those nutrients might be important for building the new community we see, or potentially creating a barrier for those trees to reestablish. And so this is early work from Kim's research. And so if we look at the nitrogen content, and these are nitrogen contents in the plant tissues, you can see that there are differences between the different species. And this just suggests that different plants are able to access nutrients in different ways, and potentially maybe benefit or not from as these nutrients become available. But probably what's most interesting is if we look at the phosphorus content, and here we're comparing natural sites to sites mounded at different times in the past. And for black spruce, Picea mariana, which is the trees that we're really trying to get to grow back on these peatland sites, there really isn't much change in phosphorus content between those treatments. But there's a pretty clear indication that the shrub, Labrador tea, has increased phosphorus content on these mounded sites. On the seismic lines in general, which may suggest that it's more competitive as this phosphorus becomes available, able to grab it before the trees can. And this may be why we see relatively good regeneration of the shrubs on the line, where we often don't see good recovery of the trees. And so this is something that Kim will be following up on through the rest of her master's thesis. In addition to those changes in the soil properties, the mineralization rates may be enhanced and decomposition may be enhanced because the lines also become warmer. And so this is just one example of some of the data we've been collecting on the surface soil temperatures on the line in green and in the adjacent undisturbed peatland. And what you can see is that on average, that temperature is higher, but there's also greater diurnal variation. which means in midday, the lines are substantially, sometimes more than 5 degrees warmer on the lines than in the adjacent forest. And this means that the microbial community can decompose organic material that's there much more rapidly. And so this is something else that we're starting to look into. This is some of the PhD research of Percy Corsaw, is that this is likely causing a change in the way that the microbial communities are actually cycling that organic material. And one way to look at that is the way that they use different carbon sources. So Percy's looked at a whole series of different carbon sources, but just to illustrate a couple of them here, it seems that it's quite site specific, and these are just different sites along the bottom here, but that clearly at some sites, there's a very big difference in the substrate use on the lines compared to the natural peatland. And so this does indicate that we're having shifts in microbial community that are going to have impacts on that carbon cycling. And that's sort of the next steps of our research now, are looking at how those carbon fluxes are actually changing on the lines. So in summary, what we know is that the seismic lines, on these seismic line disturbances, we have compaction of the soil, which leads to wetter conditions and also warmer soils than the undisturbed ecosystems. And that active soil disturbance combined with these changes in conditions has led to carbon loss from the near surface soil. In peatlands, mounding does help to overcome this by decreasing soil moisture, but the soils often still remain wetter and more compacted than undisturbed sites, the highs in the undisturbed sites, and mounding potentially results in additional carbon loss. All of these changes that are going on in the environmental conditions, as well as the plant communities, are having an effect on the carbon and greenhouse gas balance, and potentially influencing competitive relationships that might affect forest recovery. But these last ones are really areas where there are ongoing active research for us in this group. And I will turn it back over to Julia now.
Thank you, Maria. Wonderful. I do have, again, only time for one single question. Maybe you can clarify this one, or I don't know, there's a lot of questions actually here in that one question embedded, so we might have to put it later more. But so the question is, to what extent would upright instead of inverted mounding technique, as described in Kim's abstract, address the problem Scott found that mounding increases compaction and organic matter decomposition?
Yeah.
I'm gonna leave it at that for now. There's another.
And maybe just to give some context for people who don't know too much about that, but as I said, often the mounds now are created by sort of scooping up and flipping over that soils, and potentially that's exposing these deeper, more compact soils. So one thing that we want to explore in the future is trying to keep the soil profile a little bit more upright as we move it. And I think that would overcome a lot of those, that compaction issue. We probably will still have a bit of compaction just because there's always disturbance involved. But by placing that really low bulk density open soil at the surface now, we should be able to have, we should see a pattern that's much more similar to the undisturbed sites, and potentially then have lower soil moisture, even lower soil moisture conditions at the surface.
Thank you, Maria. Carolyn, for the second part of your question, if you don't mind holding on to that, and we'll put it in the discussion section. I do think we need to move on, but thank you for your question. Next up is Scott Nielsen from the University of Alberta, speaking about the vegetation team insights.
Okay, can everyone see that? Great. So my name is Scott Nielsen. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta, lead of the vegetation team. And as Greg had introduced earlier, the two key questions in my lab and the research group that we've been looking at are what factors affect regeneration and recovery, and can we estimate future recovery trajectories? With this work primarily being in seismic lines, but some OSC, oil sands exploration well sites. So the project team is composed, again, myself and a number of different students, two PhD students, Angelo Filicetti, Laureen, who's also part of the Alberta Biodiversity Conservation Chair Program, Caroline, a postdoc, former postdoc, Federico, current postdoc, assisting with Angelo on one particular project, also with Alberta Biodiversity Conservation Chair Program, Ryan LaPointe, former Masters of Forestry student, Michael Thompson, current Masters of Forestry student, and 2 former undergraduates, Cassandra and Charlotte. So like everyone else, I don't have time to share everyone's research, so I'll have to highlight a few of these different projects. But overall, the research framework and design in the lab is to look at the connections or linkages and relationships between these oil sands exploration, the OSE footprints, how it affects the microterrain or microtopography with some variation in soils and water, similar things to what Maria was discussing, but a lot less detail there. Microclimate and light on things like seismic lines, and the interaction of wildfires, how wildfires may influence recovery or tree regeneration on seismic lines, or even things like the microtopography. But oil sands footprints can also influence patterns in wildfires as well. And ultimately also how treatments such as mounding obviously influence that microterrain or microtopography, which influences things like water availability and how that affects either natural tree regeneration or the success of planted trees ultimately for restoration. So go through a couple of these different projects. First one, seismic lines simplify microtopography in peatlands. So we've kind of known that for a while, but honestly, what we didn't know is the effect size, like to what degree does this happen? And do fires recover some of this? Because there's some publications that suggest fires can actually, post-fire, some of the natural hummock nature of peatlands can be restored naturally. So this particular project led by Cassandra Stevenson with Angelo and myself, 113 sites, and basically compared these burned, unburned sites with a high precision altimeter that measures elevation at less than a millimeter resolution. Key results in this graph here on the right side, this is the first result. The average depression depth of seismic lines in peatlands is 8 centimeters. So we kind of know what that average depth is now, or depression. There was no significant difference between fires. So this graph here, burnt lines in red, unburnt lines in blue, all have, these seismic lines all have this, 5 to 10 centimeter depression averaged across different ecosites. So bog, poor fen, rich fen, and poor mesic. Poor mesic is more of a transition to upland. And then the burnt and green across different depths, because those are really our reference. So no effective fire. What I don't show is a different graph that shows terrain complexity, or the microtopographic complexity. That is, how much hummock nature do we have in these burnt lines, unburnt lines, and in different forests. What we found is, on average, there's about 20% less complexity on seismic lines as compared to forest, and no effective fires again. More on the abiotic side of things, seismic line geometry affects the microclimate and tree regeneration. This was led by Caroline Franklin, the postdoc, and Angelo assisting as well. Here the study designed 24 different seismic lines divided into wide or narrow lines, and either east or north, east-west or northwest orientation, and then measured different abiotic conditions, light, temperature, humidity, and of course tree regeneration, which is what we're particularly interested in. So over on the left hand or the right hand side here, this is just for one example. I can't show all the results here, but an east-west oriented seismic line. The light levels on average across the center of the seismic line moving into the forest from the south edge of the seismic line, and moving into the forest from the north edge of the seismic line. Light levels, of course, in the forest are pretty low. Interestingly, the south edge here is pretty low, right on the edge of the seismic line itself, fairly consistent with the forest. You'll see in some instances that orientation of the seismic line can make a big difference in peaking light conditions on certain sides of the seismic line or in the middle of the seismic line. And as a reference, the largest footprints, openings, larger well pads, about 1 hectare in size, we're averaging about 60,000 lux per day. While you can see even the seismic lines that increase light levels, that's still only, about 30–40% of that of a full open condition. And then tree regeneration. Here are the patterns of tree regeneration moving into the forest to 25 meters on either side, similar to the prior graph. The seismic line, in this case, wider seismic lines right on the middle of the seismic lines tended to have the highest tree regeneration, averaging a little over 5,000 stems per hectare. But note, even, well, this graph doesn't really show the scales. I'll talk about some of the tree regeneration on seismic lines in more detail in the next few slides. So Angelo Filicetti in the lab has created a series of different studies, as well as Michael Thompson on some other footprints. Here we're looking at how fire may promote tree regeneration. So maybe fires will recover seismic lines without having to treat them at a higher cost. So there's a number of different studies, individual studies by ecosite over 3 years, tree regeneration on seismic lines and OSE well pads versus adjacent forests were looked at in burned and unburned sites. So here, well, first of all, I'm not going to show, but on regeneration in jack pine. Well, of course, jack pine post-fire, serotinous cones, it requires fire for natural regeneration. But interestingly, tree regeneration density was about 2 times higher on seismic lines than in the adjacent forest. So it was actually thicker on the lines than the forest. Exploratory well sites had approximately about 20% higher tree regeneration as compared to the adjacent forest. And peatlands are what I illustrate here on the right-hand side. So here, again, burnt seismic lines are red, unburnt lines blue, and then the burnt forest orange and unburned forest in green. So this is Angelo's most recent paper in revision right now, by ecosite, bog, poor fen, rich fen, and poor mesic. So the first thing to note is the scale. We're already at a scale of 4,000 stems per hectare, which is plenty sufficient for stocking rates of recovery in these places in general across all different treatments, even on burned seismic lines. But you will note in bogs and poor mesic sites that burnt seismic lines were many fold higher tree regeneration rates, over 40,000 stems per hectare on burned seismic lines in bogs and poor mesic, while the fens, both poor fens and rich fens, there's very little difference. There's no statistical difference between burned lines and unburned lines, and in fact, no statistical difference with the adjacent forest natural regeneration. Also with fire, oil sands exploration features or footprints can also promote a kind of a unique phenomenon of fire refugia. Here's an example of reindeer lichens that Michael Thompson was working with. Here, the image on the right side, the photographs kind of tell the whole story, at least in a little bit lower fire severity. Many of the footprints themselves don't burn or burn at extremely low fire severity, which can create a refugia for species that are fire sensitive, such as ground lichens that are important for woodland caribou. So here Michael compared lichen cover on oil sands, exploration lines, seismic lines, and well sites. In this case, in those images, as you can see in the xeric pine forest systems, to assess refugia and regrowth. And bottom line is there's a 10-fold higher cover or abundance of lichens on the footprints as compared to the adjacent forest. And with restoration, one of the key questions is what is happening with restoration relative to both the natural vegetation, the understory vegetation, and of course, tree recruitment. So this first one here, Laureen examined the understory vegetation patterns at the Kirby site 3 years post-restoration of mounded, unmounded lines, looking at level, slope, and top of mounds, so the position of the hummocks with this understory vegetation. So on the left-hand side here, species richness in the first results. Forests in general These results aren't surprising. Other studies have already shown this. Seismic lines tend to have a higher diversity in species richness of species than adjacent forests. The opening of the forests and the disturbances can promote more herbaceous vegetation and low shrub cover and species. On the right-hand side, here's an example. She looked at a number of different groups and individual species cover, but here the group of bryophyte cover by position, so the level slopes of the hummocks, and the top of the hummocks are mounds by different treatments here. So the treatments, again, would be forest, just as you see here, forest, mounded, unmounded from left to right. So a level position and no differences in bryophytes. The slope position, there's a decrease on the mounded, and there's a dramatic decrease of bryophytes in sphagnum on the top of the mounds, which are the driest parts that are probably less supportive of bryophyte cover. Again, this is only 3 years post treatments, so these things could change over time. But some of these bryophytes are important for microsites for tree recruitment, so that is a bit concerning. The mounding does promote tree regeneration on most lines. So Angelo looked at the Kirby and Lydia linear restoration projects at a number of different sites. And here we again have the bog, poor fen, rich fen, and poor mesic ecosites, and tree regeneration on the left-hand side, the y-axis. And red again is treated line, blue untreated line, green adjacent forest. So overall, on a general sense, there's about 3 times as much tree establishment on treated versus untreated lines, except for in poor fens. So in poor fens here, you see there's no statistical difference between untreated and treated line, suggesting that treatments in these places may be, well, it may not be efficient and required, and cost savings could be incurred here. Planting rate, about 1,300 stems per hectare, which is fairly standard in forestry, is here. So even in untreated seismic lines, we generally see, or we do see, higher regeneration rates above that, which is even traditionally stocked for treatments of seismic lines and even in forestry. So there's natural high regeneration across these sites, which may also question, in some instances in the short term, the need for some of this restoration treatments in some sites. The last part here is trajectory models predict site and landscape patterns. So like I said, well, gee, if we see a lot of tree establishment at these sites, yet we see these issues of why do we have seismic lines that are still open 50 years later, there's a few things. One, it's very possible that some of the tree establishment may occur, but tree growth could be limited. So succession could be limited in this arrested succession state. And it is possible, however, that some of those older seismic lines in those studies were done through much more disturbed methods, such as bulldozers, and some of the more recent seismic lines may be much better off in recovery. So this last step here with both Angelo and Federico working on this project is first to predict regeneration density rates across the landscape, predict growth of individual trees, and then predict in space and time that those recovery rates through, in this case, dendrochronology. They're looking at age by height and time to height calculations. So the methods that Angelo has used here is taking cookies at different heights of trees on seismic lines by different species at 0.5 meter increments. Each individual tree or sapling was sectioned for cookies at a ½ meter up to 2 meters, and every 1 meter after 2 meters is this example tree here, taking cookies at each of those locations. And with those cookies, calculating age at height to give us estimates of growth. So as one example here, I don't have time to talk about all of this, but for black spruce, here are 2 different models with a focus on the 3 key variables of characteristics of seismic lines and fire. There are some other environmental variables such as depth to water or terrain wetness that are being used to predict these things, but I'll focus on these variables. For density, the wider the lines, the more dense the black spruce. The orientation of the seismic line had no effect on black spruce density, but fire also increased black spruce density, which is consistent with the prior studies that Angela's had. But more important, the growth in years to reach this example of 1 meter height. As lines became wider, the growth rate decreased significantly. And for bearing, this is an indicator variable of north-south oriented lines versus east-west lines. The north-south lines have a significant increase in growth rates as compared to east-west lines, but fire had no effect in growth. So although fire can recruit greater amounts of in this case, black spruce, doesn't have any effect post-fire on growth rates. So in summary, how does this work address key management needs? The first is fire recovers most ecosites except for fens. So if you can wait for a fire, well, they can probably do the work for you at no cost. Mounding in peatlands recruits trees, but not so much in poor fens, questioning the use of mounding treatments and silvicultural treatments in those sites. Mounding does not restore the understory, at least in the short term, such as especially the mound tops, as chlorine is found. Many ecosites have natural regeneration even without treatments. So that's, I think, an important concept here. But the next key question is whether those trees will grow to forest recovery. Again, they could be in this state of arrested succession if there's limitations such as high water table, although you could have initial tree establishment with flooding in the roots and may restrict future growth and recovery or trajectories towards forest conditions. So ultimately, where to treat and not treat is an important question, as Greg was talking about, and thanks for your support.
Thank you very much, Scott, for this overview. We have time for one quick question. There's one question that just came in, and it's on the tree regeneration density. I think it came up a couple of slides ago. So the comment is that it's on burned lines, that the regeneration in bogs seems very high. And what is considered in the metric? They want to know what trees, or like how, I think there are tens of thousands, or
yeah, how many trees per hectare in bog in this instance, in untreated lines? Was that the question?
In burned lines, bogs. It
well,
seems
yeah,
very high is the observation.
Yeah,
I think one slide back, maybe. One slide
well, this
back,
is,
I think that one.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah, so in bog, the burnt lines we're seeing, 40 to 50,000 stems per hectare. So extremely dense regeneration in peatland bogs post-fire on lines. Yeah, as compared to the lines themselves at 8,000. So, five-fold increase. But just to point out, 8,000 stems per hectare in an unburnt line is still pretty high density.
Yeah.
3 times the stocking rate typically.
Okay, we will follow this. We can follow this up a little bit in more detail if more clarification needs to be made.
Sure.
Thank you, Scott. With this, we would like to continue now with the wildlife team. Erin Dane will provide an overview of the research insights of that team.
Great. Julia, can you see the screen?
I can. And sorry, I'm going to interject. I should have said that just in between in the break. We do have 3 spots open up now in the Zoom meet. So if you have any colleagues that have maybe told you I cannot get in, if you wouldn't mind passing on the message, there's 3 spots open now in the Zoom channel. So yeah, Erin, please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for participating today. So today I'm going to talk about the wildlife angle, but as Greg talked about, a big part of what BERA has been about is testing new technologies for understanding the response of, biodiversity essentially to many of the disturbances we're talking about. So the technology I'm going to talk a little bit about today is called autonomous recording units, or ARUs, and there's a picture of one there on the side. I'm going to talk about some of the ways we've been trying to improve that technology for helping us understand what is an impact and what is recovery. And then we're going to move into talking about how energy sector disturbances, do or do not recover from the perspective of birds. And we'll talk a little bit about how we measure vegetation on these disturbances and the impacts that has on our interpretation. And then we'll focus a little bit on spatial scale and cumulative effects, and recognize that, not the only things that are happening in the world do not just change vegetation, they change a lot of other phenomena that we also need to look at and address. Now, a big part of BERA and many other projects I work on actually start not so much on recovery, because I think it's important to look at recovery, but that's making an assumption there's an impact in the first place. So understanding if there is an impact or an effect is really, really important. And one of the things that's very, very important is evaluating whether or not the way you ask the question has an influence on the answer. So here we're going to use a standard approach that's been used a lot in the world of environmental impact assessment. It's called the human point count. So a human stands at a location, listens for the birds that they can hear or see, and records what they observe. And a lot of those have been in sort of what I would call a control impact scenario, where you stand on a disturbance like a pipeline represented by this white area, you count the birds that you hear, and you compare that to somewhere in the forest interior, or you compare it to an early seral forest due to harvest or something like that. Now, the area that you sample when you ask that question has a very strong influence on the answer that you get. So, for example, here, if we're standing on this pipeline counting all the birds we hear and see, and the area that we sample is, say, 150-meter radius around ourselves, a lot of what we're counting isn't the pipeline anymore, it's the forest and the forest edge. Whereas if we use a more limited distance radius point count, say something like 50 meters, we're counting much more the effect of the pipeline itself rather than the edge or the forest interior, etc. And a lot of times this is honestly ignored in the literature. The area that you sample and the impact that it has on your interpretation of effects changes quite a bit. So one of the things we did very early in the BERA project was, in participation with BERA, was to put together all the human point counts that existed that we could find. And we looked at how seismic lines, pipelines, and well sites, as human beings did point counts, how they influenced our interpretation of the impact. So what this represents is, compared to using a 50-meter point count, what was the magnitude of the effect, what was the uncertainty of the effect, and what was the probability of detecting an effect of seismic lines, pipelines, and well sites compared to the forest interior. And really what we found is that the smaller the radius of the point count that you use, the more likely you were going to find a bigger effect, the more likely you were going to find a statistically significant effect, and the more certain you were of the confidence intervals. So the area that you sample has a really big influence on this interpretation. So for example, just to take this one in the extreme, we concluded if we used unlimited distance point counts that well sites had absolutely no effect on the bird community. Whereas if we used a 50-meter radius point count, we found that the community was about 85% different than the forest interior. So your interpretation really depends on the way you do these things. So Richard Headley is a postdoc with myself who's been very instrumental in saying, okay, how are we going to deal with that challenge going forward? We've got this distance problem, we've got this identifying where the birds actually are. How do we figure out, what they're doing in response to the small scale disturbances like pipeline, seismic lines, and well sites? So what Richard has helped develop is what we've called the sound triangulation grid approach. And so this involves ARUs, and each one of these dots represents an ARU. And these ARUs are GPS time synced, so that what happens is you have a bird, and that bird, say, is right here. He sings, and that sends that sound to all of the ARUs on this grid. But the time at which the sound arrives at each one of those is slightly different. It can be milliseconds different, but if you actually have a clear enough array where the times are properly synced, you can actually figure out within a meter or two exactly where the bird is. Now humans, while we can estimate distance, we do it very poorly, can get nowhere near this 1 meter accuracy. So this was a huge leap forward in our ability to understand where were the birds actually positioning themselves relative to the seismic line or the well pad. Were they on the edge? Were they on the disturbance itself? Or were they way into the forest interior? So for example, in this one, we see all these little dots. This represents all of the singing locations of one individual. The blue is all of the singing locations of another individual, so on and so forth. Now, this approach, which we call triangulation, is the most accurate method you are ever going to get for measuring location, density, distance, all of these things. But it's incredibly expensive. And what I mean by that is just the time and effort in terms of the number of ARUs, the manpower to lay this out, etc. It's a lot. And so the consequence is you get extremely good data, but you don't get very much. So what the other thing Richard did was he tried to say, okay, is there a way that I could get a reasonable estimate of where the birds are from an ARU? So the idea here is, given that we knew the exact locations of these individuals using the triangulation grid, could I use this ARU right in the middle of the well pad and some metric that I could get off of a single ARU recording to figure out where the bird was? So what Richard did is he looked at something called relative sound level, which is effectively how loud are the birds. And he looked at, when we knew exactly where they were, how loud would they be as a function of distance? And these graphs all show that relationship for different species. And what Richard was able to do is, with using certain set of cutoffs and thresholds, we can be about 95% certain on a well pad situation whether the bird is on or off, simply based on the relative sound decibel level for a single ARU. So going forward in the future, we basically have created a method that you can put a single ARU on a well pad and do these different distance kind of estimations to evaluate what the effect or the recovery state of birds is in relation to these kinds of disturbances. Now, Jocelyn Gregoire, she's an MSc just wrapping up right this summer, used this approach to study a bird called the Canada warbler and to look at how it used seismic lines. So the Canada warbler is a threatened species. It migrates down to the Dominican Republic and Costa Rica, places like that. And it likes aspen forest, old aspen forests with a high density of shrubs. And so Jocelyn looked at two main questions. Were the Canada warblers likely to be present? In other words, were they occupying a certain area around seismic lines of different recovery states? And then she also used the sound triangulation approach to look at how did they use the seismic lines specifically. So here at the top, we have what's called occupancy. So was the species simply present or not? And we have a vegetation recovery gradient that you can see going from highly disturbed with a lot of quad traffic, which we'll talk a little bit about after, that's very important, to a decreasing amount of footprint where you have the line essentially has disappeared. And what she found was that actually on these lines where you've had a lot of quad traffic, where there's a lot of dirt and mud on the surface, the Canada warblers, they're nowhere near these seismic lines. They avoid them. But with relatively limited vegetation, they will exist in the forest around the line. The next question was, okay, so Canada warblers will be around lines that have some vegetation recovery on them, but how do they behave when they're near those? And so with the sound triangulation approach, she was able to look at how low shrub, tall shrubs, or actually having tree saplings on the line influenced whether the Canada warblers would sing from the seismic line or not. And what she found is that with tall shrubs, and tall shrubs being, shrubby plants, in and around greater than 1 meter in height, we were starting to get the birds actually singing from the seismic lines. In this, we also looked at the question of whether the birds would cross the seismic lines and they'd go from one side to the other. In other words, the idea is being, are they holding a territory that includes the seismic line within it? And we found again, when you hit this tall shrubs or trees starting to regrow, that the birds were actually living across it. So what this demonstrates is that, if you can measure the vegetation of these lines remotely, we can give you a pretty good idea of which areas are recovered from the perspective of a Canada warbler. Now, Scott Wilson did his master's, a very similar principle to what Jocelyn did, except he looked at reclaimed well sites. So these, again, are traditional, conventional sites. They're about 1 hectare in size, and they've been officially reclaimed by the province, and they've become turned back to the Crown. And so what we looked at is we used both drone imagery and some LiDAR and other components to look at whether or not the whole bird community, how it was reacting to these, and how a specific species, this one called the ovenbird, was actually using the well pads. And so this is an example where we're actually able to map the territory of each individual and we can actually figure out what proportion of the time the individual birds are spending on the well pad itself. And what Scott found is, again, is that as canopy cover increased on the well site, that the probability of an ovenbird using that as part of their territory increased. So again, we are seeing recovery of well pads once they reach a particular vegetated state. Now, one of the things to highlight is, the time since they've been considered reclaimed, and the amount of use by an ovenbird is not, for example, happening as rapidly as a harvest cut block. Ovenbirds will use harvest cut blocks starting at around 20 years of age. Some of these well pads that had the canopy closure were already 40 years since post-recovery. But the point is, they do recover, although they do take a little bit longer than, say, a fire or a harvest block. Now, Connor used the same kind of approach and studied a bird called the brown creeper. Now, this is more of a forestry-oriented question, but this is an example of something that's called understory protection. And what you kind of can see here is understory protection is almost like seismic lines in a way, in that you take the feller buncher, you drive into the forest, you cut about a 3 to 4 meter wide path for the feller buncher to go, and then rather than cut all the trees, you reach in and you cut the canopy aspen and you leave the understory white spruce standing. So it creates it's a thinned out stand functionally with a bunch of linear features throughout it. And what we found generally across the bird community was that this was it retained a far greater proportion of the original bird community than a standard cut block. But what we were interested in more so in relation to BERA was, well, what is it in these stands that the birds are actually using? So Connor looked at a bird called the brown creeper, which is a species that likes really tall conifer trees for a variety of reasons. And then he looked at and evaluated how using an ARU and intensity of use and occupancy influenced our perspective on what did the bird like in these understory protection blocks. And what he actually found was that using LiDAR, he found that as the height of the original old growth stand increased, we had a greater probability of having a brown creeper being present, which is totally logical because the birds need big white spruce or big trees to, for their nests and to forage and other things. But then when he actually asked the question, are the birds present in understory protection blocks, and what kind of understory protection blocks are they in, he found that it was the exact opposite. And this one in areas with shorter trees. And that made absolutely no sense when you thought about it from this perspective. Now, this was using Alberta vegetation inventory and the concept of occupancy. Now, when he went and measured intensity of use and started to look at the actual space use of the birds, and he also used LiDAR, he found that the proportion of returns in the LiDAR profile between the 10 to 20 meter height class was showing, again, a positive relationship. So the more hits you had in that 10 to 20 meter height zone, the more likely you were to have that brown creeper using that habitat. And the reason was the ABI that he used here, where he was looking at canopy height and occupancy, was really not measuring the right thing. Because what the birds were using was the very dense white spruce, and so this LiDAR was a much more effective way of vegetation the birds actually needed. So it sort of shows the importance of both combining high resolution bird data with intensity of use and looking at where the birds actually are, and LiDAR provides this capability to reveal patterns that are probably much more subtle than we would have thought, so using some of the coarser methods. Now, a big part of what we did and how we have been doing with projects like BERA is that the data the students collect becomes part of a much larger inventory of data that we are using to build an overall evaluation of the state of birds in provincial scales, in the oil sands region perspective, et cetera. So Peter Solomos works with me very closely on this to bring together all of my students' projects, all of any other researchers' projects, to bring them into one global model that sort of tries to evaluate the state of how birds are reacting. And this is, of course, available on ABMI's biodiversity browser, is where the results are. And what you're seeing here on the left is the traditional results that have been reflected on that site for a long time. And what you see here is, for example, we talk about the amount of agricultural footprint and the effect it has on species and forestry and energy and rural, urban, and transportation. One of the things that we're doing right now as a result of the BERA work and other programs like it is we're actually now trying to also pull apart the various specific activities of each sector to provide an evaluation of their importance. So for example, in this table, what we're showing is knowing the total amount of roads, pipelines, mine sites, well sites, industrial sites, and seismic lines, what impact is that likely having on the population of this bird called the ovenbird in terms of how many individuals are we losing from habitat disturbance. Now, one of the things I'll put in as a caveat is that we're capable now of doing this. We have the data for the birds to be able to account for vegetation recovery. We just do not at this point in time have the remote sensing at the entire oil sands region or the provincial scale to be able to account for that. So, you know, these models still have a ways to go in that we have the capacity to tell you this is how the bird will react to this exact seismic line, and its vegetation class, but we don't actually have that data everywhere yet. So that's where the work of Greg has been very fundamental, and it's now time to make that operational if we want to use this for wildlife. Now, a lot of these models that Peter has put together, people ask, you know, how good are these? What should I use them for? These kinds of things. And so the answer to that depends on what your objective is. So if you want to know, is a species present at an exact location? Our models will do okay. They're not going to be 100% correct. You can't go there and be 100% guaranteed that I'm going to find a Canada warbler at this spot. But if you are interested in finding out where those Canada warblers are in the oil sands region, all of the data that we've just talked about and much, much more is available on our Wild Tracks website. And so you can go there. If you're more interested in finding out what's the probability of finding a species on average in any given place in Alberta, we've created a R package called Cure for Insect. And this is one where you can go in, type in any location that you want in the province, and it will give you an estimate of the density of any species that you want of bird in that particular spot. Now, the last thing, and the thing that Lionel Leston's been working on with me, is trying to look at, again, how good are these models at telling us about the overall impact of, you know, all of the different things that are happening on the landscape on birds. And one of the things that's really interesting is that these models increase in their ability to predict bird abundance accurately as a function of scale. So let me just quickly walk through what I mean by this. All of these black dots represent human-based or ARU-based point counts that have been done somewhere in Alberta. They're the building blocks of everything that you saw from the biodiversity browser, and we've used those to make these models. Now what we did is we tried to say, well, how good were those at predicting the size of a bird population in a set of data that were not used to build the models? In other words, validating them. But what we did is we created something called the Big Grid Project, where sometimes we put together 4 points to represent a landscape, 9, 16, 25, or 100. And then we use these black dot models to predict how many birds did we observe and how many birds did we expect based on the model. And what each one of these lines represents is how accurately, in terms of an R-squared, we were at predicting the abundance of the birds. Found is that as spatial scale increased, our ability to accurately predict also increased. So what this suggests is, you know, these models are going to be not as good at a single point at predicting the number of birds you're going to observe. But as the landscape size gets bigger and bigger and bigger, we're getting better and better and more accurate at predicting exactly the population consequence. So again, very good models, I would argue, for making predictions about landscape scale cumulative effects. Now, a couple last things. Lionel has also been trying, and Brendan Casey have been trying to improve these models even further. So all of the models I just showed you from the biodiversity browser are based on Alberta vegetation inventory. So forest resource things like a forestry company would provide ABMI's wall-to-wall human footprint. But there's also other remote sensing products out there. Greg's talked about the value of LiDAR. There's this product here by Anarcan called the Baudouin layers that also provide a whole bunch of other variables. And so what we looked at is we're trying to see, can combining these different GIS layers give us better predictions than just using one alone? And this is an example for the alder flycatcher. And if we just used AVI, the R-squared was 9%, whereas we used Baudouin, which is this remote sensing, is 18%, LiDAR was 30%. But when we combine those together, we actually were explaining 36% of the variation in alder flycatcher. So it suggests that by combining these remote sensing products, we're going to improve our capacity to predict where birds are. But again, the key is better and more continuous remote sensing. And this one just summarizes sort of what combinations of these different GIS layers influence a similar number of species. So what you can see is, LiDAR is there very consistently is improving the models quite a bit. So it suggests that our capacity to improve and predict where wildlife is going to be would be improved by having much better LiDAR everywhere. Last thing is we've been working on is vegetation is not the only thing that's changing. All of the things that we talk about here, the roads, the well sites, the compressor stations, the processing facilities, they have people at them. And those people make noise, those people make light, those people drive cars. And those disturbances are also part of the equation of what we need to work on. So Natalie and Richard have been kind of exploring how noise from different types of activities, whether that be hunting, which is up here in the top, or whether it be compressor stations, or whether it be facilities, are influencing some of the birds. Now, these are early days for some of this work, but it's certainly, we've been exploring now what's the relative importance of the vegetation disturbance versus these other activities. So just to quickly wrap up, energy footprints are definitely recovering from the perspective of birds. There are different thresholds for different species, so no one size fits all. But we do have these vegetation metrics now that can be used to say, yes, that line or that well pad from this bird's perspective can be considered recovered. Now, different approaches to measuring birds does matter, right? So it depends on whether you want to use behavioral responses or population responses, because that does influence your perspective, but that is something that we can obviously have discussions about. Better remote sensing gives you better risk assessment and better impact assessment. And the final thing is the accuracy of the models is definitely scale dependent. So how you use them, you need to be cautious and know, what the strengths and weaknesses of models are generally. So with that, again, thank you all for your support over the last years, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there's time, and I'm done.
Thank you very, very much, Aaron. Unfortunately, there is 0 time, but yes, this was great. Thank you so much. I do hope that many of you can stay beyond 11 o'clock, that we can engage more on these topics. I do want to now go to our last presentation of the morning, the synthesis talk by Steve Liang from the University of Calgary on the Internet of Things.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. So I'm going to talk about the things we built in the past couple of years, and this is the IoT Internet of Things. And my research lab is supported by the, in general, Rogers IoT Research Chair at the University of Calgary. And then these are the names who are involved in this project. Okay, so if you look at this, we are building something. And we are building an open source end-to-end IoT system. So that means involve 3 basically components. The first component is a open source. We want to build something open source. It's a hardware, but it's a hardware involved the processor, the network, the antenna, and the enclosure, and the algorithms go into this hardware so we can put in the field, and maybe and the power supply as well. So I want to experimenting, okay, can we build a robust sensor device, connect to network, so upload data real time and hopefully last for a long time and survive in the field using the open source stuff, because these sensor networks really exist, but they are very expensive, right? So 100,000 pop if you want something that robust. So that's number 1. But with that, the sensors, you also need to have a cloud and to manage the data, and you need to have the interfaces to get the data in, and then you can do processing in the cloud. So that's number 2. And the third component is the applications. So first of all, you need a web application to connect to the multiple sensor clouds. And then you need some algorithm to see how can we take advantage of data and do some analysis. So my presentation will be following these 3 different parts and see the result and the impact. So the first part is the we're showing you the 5 iterations, at least 5, over the couple past years, right? So basically, I don't want to go into details, but we tried different processors, we tried different platforms, we tried different open source hardware, we tried different antenna and the communication technologies, and then we're moving in different price points and different gateway as well. And then we're moving to all the way to something we think might fit into this application and purpose. So here we, in the third year, we start, or after 2 years, and we start to experiment in LoRa at a very early stage. At the time, it was very difficult to get any parts or even the chips, and so we can develop the application. But actually, when we see the technology evolve, right, we think we made the right decision. So right now, you can start to see commercial products now. So potential multi-year battery life, that's good. It's long range, potential for multi-kilometers wireless coverage from a single gateway. For example, in the city of Calgary, deploy 3 gateways and cover the Calgary. And then there are commercial products available now in the last year. And then actually we get our hands on some of the commercial products. And they function quite nicely. And there's open source cloud gateway available. That means they are, you need a supporting underlying cloud infrastructure for that as well. So LoRa is something we recommend. It's like a star technology you can use. However, don't forget about actually telcos like Rogers and Telus. They have similar network technologies and available in a few years. So if you want something to manage for you, and then it can wait for a couple of years, and it's a good, the other things you can try. And the next one is you need an interface and data model so that you can build a cloud that is interoperable and with most people use it, right? Future proof. And so the first step is we develop some international standards. I'm very happy to report to you the standard. This has become voted approved, become international standard in OGC. So there are 2 parts, Sensor Things API, and also adopted by United Nations ITU-T. So it's true global impact. But what does that mean? So global impact, this has been endorsed as the international standards around the world. European Union, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, US Department of Homeland Security, Iraq, and NATO, for example, for connecting sensor networks. And we publish a standard, and there are a lot of open source projects on it. So very active research area based on the standard we published. And then more than 100 open source projects, more than 400 publications, research about this standard, and more than actually a great thing is more than 10 cloud implementations available. It's a true international standard. What does that mean? If your organization have disparate source of sensor observations, that means you have several different sensor networks for water, air, or environmental monitoring, soil, and BERA sensor cloud architecture, this architecture can aggregate them into a single source of truth, and scalable, extensible, interoperable, and future-proof. And then below are the organizations that implement the standard we developed. So open source, big companies, small companies, research institutes around the world. Now, of course, you need the application that this is the third part. You need application and our sensor network. So the difference between this from the like any other application you saw is this connect to allow you to connect to multiple different instances from different organizations or different departments. And others are, you search for a sensor, you connect to it, you can get the data, you can download data, display data. And then we have 2 versions, one 3D, one is 2D. So, and they are all available in the GitHub. And the final part is we tried some analytics that you can put either in the sensors, but most of them, they are not suitable for a remote area for a long time. We're talking about months or years, right? So we tried air pressure sensor, air pressure for vehicle counting, works, need harden in the field application. That means you need hardware vendor to do that. IMU for footprint usage, and then power hungry, so not very useful for the edge processing. And then dynamic time warping, for example, for time series classification. application, automatically identify microclimate detection, and it works. Yeah, but we didn't invent that. We just try it. Very happy to say that we have very good documentation in the GitHub, including how to set it up and how to use the platform. And so it's really ready for knowledge and code transfer. So that's a great process, a great result from this project. In summary, our cloud aggregates disparate sensor data into a single source of truth and offers scalable, extensible, interoperable, and future-proof way to manage the data. And it has been, has a global impact. So we're very happy about that. And monitoring with low-cost, long-range sensor networks becoming a reality. So we clearly see that evolving in the past couple of years, and we start to see commercial solutions available. And while the open source sensor hardware work in a controlled indoor-outdoor environment, they are not field deployment ready out of the box. We did some experiment, and actually, you know what? If you want something that really works for multiple years with scientific grade, called Campbell Scientific, right? There's a reason they're expensive. So the open source hardware is not there. It's not like today you can use open source hardware to do a commercial grade product. Open source hardware is not there yet. Okay, and then so we also think about what other potential applications for our sponsor, right? So for example, methane emission management is a very good way that this technology can be used. Managing contractors of their safety and productivity, and for environmental monitoring or for methane, that'll be very useful. We talked to some upper level management in oil and gas company. They really like the idea about methane and contractor management and work permit clearance and turnaround. So these are some of the potential applications for oil and gas. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Any questions? Julia, back to you.
Hey, thank you very much, Steve. Are there any quick clarifying questions for Steve before we move into the more wider discussion? I'm not seeing anything coming in, so thank you for now, Steve. We do have about 5 minutes for a little bit of open, comments. If somebody has something to share as a general observation, comment, feedback in the next 5 minutes, maybe you can raise your hand and we can go through it this way. And then Greg will give a summary, and then we will move afterwards at 11 o'clock in a really more open dialogue. So any sort of overall questions, because this now concludes the synthesis presentations. I mean, there's a wealth of information that we've gotten, so it's probably, lots to digest, but any comments at this stage, please? And please feel free to unmute yourself and just, whoever gets first will start. Otherwise, if we have a scramble, I'll shut them down, but anybody, please welcome.
I guess I can speak up. It's Danielle.
Danielle?
Sure.
Hello.
Can you
Maybe
hear me?
Now it's better, yes. It was a bit quiet.
Okay. Thank you to the presenters. I really appreciate the synthesis and information that was passed along. Maybe just a comment for further discussion afterwards, but I would be interested in particular, Aaron's comment about the need for better remote sensing data is key for the bird habitat models. And I'm interested in what specifically is the issues or what is lacking currently. Is it the accuracy, or that current remote sensing data is out of date that government has? Are there any recommendations for government around what specific products would be helpful or useful that we could make some progress on? Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle.
I mean, I'll just go with my main one is oftentimes there's lots of great data here, there, and everywhere, and so you can make an amazing model for one place, and then somewhere in between is crap, and that's because we just don't have it consistently. So the importance of defining the study area and then being consistent across it is the #1 thing for, truly scaling this kind of stuff up. Greg can speak more to the resolution of the data, but from my perspective, it's really often about consistency. I spend way too much time trying to figure out a solution to dealing with that hole in data is a big problem for me.
Maybe I can say a few words about this. I mean, I think historically the province has focused on capturing optical data, so photography from aircraft, and that's been the foundation for much of the AVI work. Really good at looking at what's on top of the land cover. So if you want to see where the trees are and where the trees aren't, I mean, that's a really good data set. Other technologies are much better at penetrating into the vegetation and capturing true 3D structure. And this is where your LiDAR and your photogrammetry comes into play. So we're super lucky in Alberta that we have provincial LiDAR across the whole province. It's sometimes hard to get a hold of that data set because it's got some, usage restrictions around it. And secondly, things come out of date. So, I mean, I think that essentially what Aaron and what I would advocate for is just kind of continued investment in various types of remote sensing. I don't want to say LiDAR is the be all end all, it's just one brand. So it's just a suite of products that are sort of more openly available and more regularly updated. I think what, most of us I hear would probably like to see.
Thank you. Other
maybe just another follow-up. Maybe in terms of frequency, it would also be good to know recommendations on how frequent would be useful as well. But I'll leave it there. I'm definitely interested in your thoughts and recommendations on how that could be improved. And for what purpose?
Yeah, the frequency definitely depends on the purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess maybe one of the challenges now with, for example, we have a mosaic of different ages, and maybe there's no way of getting around that. But even the really high value LiDAR in the province in many cases is now getting quite old. So I think that this would be a much broader discussion as to like what the frequency would be, because every stakeholder will have a different opinion.
Yeah, sounds good.
I had a follow-up question for Maria. You had talked a little bit about the effect on soil bulk density if we are to not invert the mounds. So if we had kind of the vegetation up. I'm just wondering if you have any data or if you can kind of speculate on what the carbon implications of that might be as well in terms of, I guess specifically, I'm wondering if we don't invert the mounds, would we have less carbon decomposition from those sites?
Yeah, so it's something that we don't know well right now, so I can speculate, but we just don't really have data on that to say that that's right or wrong. Our thinking though is that, so what we know is when you invert the mound, you're kind of bringing up this old carbon, which actually, you're causing a lot of disturbance, so it is enhancing mineralization, but that carbon is not as readily available to microbes as fresh carbon would be. So we've done a couple experiments in the lab that show that. But if we think about a whole carbon balance point of view, there's a second advantage by keeping it upright in that you have the plants more or less intact. And Scott Nielsen showed some data there that on the tops of these mounds, we don't have a lot of bryophytes, and that's largely because we buried them, right? So I think there's probably a lot of advantage from an overall ecosystem carbon point of view. I'm not sure how much will stop. I think there will still be some carbon loss because you're physically still lifting up and disturbing the soil, but you're likely to sort of turn the carbon sink back on faster because you have the plants in place. Hopefully you'll get a tree in place that'll also start growing, but you've got the ground layer plants in place that can already start to take up carbon and compensate for those soil carbon losses. So this is something that we're testing at a couple of our own sites and hoping to push forward with a bunch of the BERA partners to be able to do side-by-side experiments now of those two techniques.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria and Matthew. I would be inclined, Greg, to give it back to you for a summary. I just don't want us to extend the formal part too long. maybe give it back to you, Greg, for your last few thoughts, and then open it up for a more general discussion. I hope all of you or many of you can stay for a little bit longer for an open dialogue. Greg, is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure. I can wrap this up really quick.
Because it's 10:59, so those people that have a pressing commitment, you know, probably better that we finish.
Okay, so I'll just take a few minutes here to wrap up. Originally, I had planned this session to be a really deep sort of introspective look of what we've accomplished in BERA, what our challenges are, what our successes are. But this is one of the things that we had to cut. So instead, I present you 4 half-baked metrics to just give you a little bit of some idea of some of the impact that we have seen kind of looking back on the project. So one of the things that we're quite proud of is the number of students and other trainees who have come through the project. We haven't done the full count yet, but there are certainly far more than 50 what we call highly qualified personnel, or HQP, that have come through BERA and contributed to the project greatly, as you've seen, but also gained a lot of experience and now will enter the workforce as very high quality and high value trainees. One of the things that we take great care to do in the project is to make sure we publish in peer-reviewed journals, open access journals that lots of people can access. So we have to date 30 peer-reviewed publications, 16 more in preparation. And really a whole lack of conference presentations, workshops, and seminars that certainly exceed more than 100. And now we have 1 webinar to put on the list as well. Actually, there's been more than 1 webinar, but this one was most memorable. Okay, in terms of what's next for BERA. So I've already said that we are now at the end of our 5-year CRD grant. So this is the end of BERA 1, this industrial research partnership. I've really enjoyed the experience. I hear that the partners are at least reasonably happy. So we made the decision to go for a second phase of BERA. So we've applied for a second round of funding through NSERC. The second round is slightly different than the first round because NSERC no longer does CRD. They now do something called alliance grants. And I think this is a nice thing because what it does is allows us to expand the partnership to not only include just industry companies, but other types of multi-sectoral partnerships. So the BERA 2 proposal, we just got it back. There's some comments we need to respond to, but we do hope that we can continue this into another 5 years of funding with an even more carefully and larger group of partners that we work closely with. With that, I think I will close things down and thank you all once again for coming, and to thank in particular our partners and students and researchers who have made this whole project possible. Of course, you're welcome to stick around for the next bit of time to speak more. Julia Linke is BERA's science coordinator. I think she should be your first point of contact, though of course all the PIs also are reachable through email and social media, and that includes myself, which I've listed here. So that's it for me. Julia, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, super. So great. Thank you very much for coming, for your interest. And I've already had some very nice comments here over the chat line that it was a great overview. Really thank you that you also enjoyed it. But I really now would like to open up the floor. Normally we do this a much better job of engaging in our real workshops. We really hope the next one we can do again in person. But I would really like now to just sit back and relax and let people start chiming in. I know I have a couple of questions and comments that were on the chat line, so maybe I'll start with those and then would like to open it up for general other questions. Is that okay with you too, Greg?
Yep.
Okay. So there was one question from Daniela. Are you still there? Yes. And it had to do with Oh yes, it was a comment or question, I think, for the vegetation team. Why tree generation and fence may not be positively responding to fire and even not responding to mounding. I hope I characterized the question well, Daniel. So yeah.
I can respond, and I'll let Angelo respond in more detail. But for us, it's presumably related more to water table issues, and so there's the depth to water in the fens, at least the sites with the seismic lines and depressions, tends to be a little bit more problematic and restricts some microsites for recruitment and growth of trees. I don't know, Angelo, are you there that you could, if you want to?
Yeah, it's probably due to the microtopography and the water table. Also, there's less black spruce, so less serotinous species. I think those are the two reasons.
Yeah, so with that lack of the microtopography that we've measured, and then the water table being relatively high in those type of sites, it definitely is more restrictive. But I mean, there's still, I think if you looked at some of those graphs, there's still, a surprising number of seedlings and small saplings at some of these sites, a little bit more so than, we're told or thought. And from aerial imagery, obviously you can see these footprints. But, my perspective is certainly there's places that are problematic and not coming back. And I think obviously the older 2D lines that were bulldozed, where the microtopography was fairly dramatically affected, the water table, the compaction, all these issues, those are really problematic sites. But I think the general, the trend towards more low impact sites, I think you'll see better natural regeneration on some of these sites, except for certain eco sites, and certainly the fens are probably the most problematic. We kind of knew that, but there still are a fairly large number of trees, more so than we thought. And those places, however, it's probably pretty, we probably doubt that with that high water table, even with some smaller seedlings or saplings, they may not be able to fully mature with the water table at that height. So more work needs to be done. But Angelo's dendrochronology chapter, that was fairly broad, about 380 sites, 1,600 trees, and 5,500 cookies. So it's a fairly large data set looking at places that are more or less recovering and growing.
Did you monitor the water table or soil moisture at those sites?
No, we didn't monitor 380 sites for water table. No. We use instead general LiDAR depth of water and things like that as proxies for that relationship. And certainly, at the broadest scale, of course, you move into the Port Mesic and the upland sites, and the water table isn't necessarily an issue or isn't an issue at all. So it's not the depth to water from, like, let's say LiDAR or a terrain wetness from regular DEMs gives us kind of a fairly crude proxy. It's not perfect for sure, but there are some patterns there, yeah.
I'm curious whether you also looked at swamps.
Swamps, no. For the most part, we haven't, no.
And I guess, Danielle, some of those poor music sites that Scott's looked at may or may not be swamps. Okay. But the other thing I was going to say is I think that those are questions that we'll be able to maybe start to get a little bit more at. Greg didn't have a chance to show some of the work that he's been doing, that his group's been doing, trying to get maps of, or better estimates of water table in the lowland areas from the really detailed DEMs from photogrammetry, but also some of Kim's work where we were looking at soil moisture. She also did vegetation surveys to try to look at, she hasn't had a chance to look at that data yet because she's really early on, but I think we'll be able to maybe start making those links a little bit more strongly. But like, as Scott said, it's hard when you do these extensive surveys, you don't really get those seasonal, it's impossible to measure like seasonal patterns of water table or soil moisture in an extensive survey like that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Really appreciate the research you shared.
Okay, Danielle, did that address the comment?
Yeah, perfect, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I do have one more from one other one, then please do, let's open it up for everybody. Carolyn asked a question for Erin Bain. Can Erin expand on the comment for Scott's bird use of reclaimed well sites that recovery for bird use of well sites versus cut blocks differs considerably in tree density and height were mentioned in abstract? And are there restoration treatment implications for well sites? Erin, can you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, certainly I can. I mean, I think the main one is, there's a lot of different kind of well sites, and that's something that I didn't stress. I mean, the ones that we looked at were, I would argue, conventional oil and gas that had been officially reclaimed. And so you can go on some of those, and some of them might be 20 years old. And because of the practice at the time, they didn't have a lot of tree growth on them, so they still were grass dominated or maybe shrub. Whereas others, for whatever reason, had considerable tree growth. But in almost all cases, the amount of time it takes to grow a tree or a shrub of an equivalent size to what you would get on a cut block, isn't keeping up on some of the historical restored sites. That being said, a lot of the new things that we're talking about are exploration wells, where the degree of disturbance to the soil is much more like low impact seismic. And those are actually part of BERA 2, which was to look at some of the specific things that we were going to be looking at in terms of well pad recovery and restoration and things like that. So that's the main thing is some of the older wells that are, quote, reclaimed are not growing trees as fast as a cut block would.
Thank you, Erin. Anybody have a question? Anna, you had, was it a thumb up or was it a hand up? I don't know if you wanted to say something.
I wanted to put my hand up, but I can't figure out how. So
I thought so. I thought the thumb up was a hand up. Please go ahead.
So that question is, I guess, for Scott and Angelo. How many years after the fire have you noticed the increased tree regeneration on seismic lines?
Maybe I'll just briefly answer, and Angelo can get in more detail. It varies by ecosite for sure, and he can explain. But he went up to 22-year-old fires and capped it at that age. But some sites certainly are regenerating much faster than others. So obviously, like the Zurich Jack Pine Forest, within 3 years post-fire, the stem densities are pretty high already and recovering, and certainly in the peatlands it's much slower. So I don't know, Angelo, if you want to explain that pattern.
Yeah, they seem to generally peak around 5 years or so, maybe 6, but you can notice it pretty quick within a year or two.
The reason I'm asking is because we went 1 year after the Fort McMurray fire in 2016. In 2017, when we went out, we haven't seen much recovery at all, but I guess maybe it was too early 1 year after.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference in the Fort McMurray fire and when we surveyed it in 2017, if you went in the spring versus the autumn. I would guess as the years go by, you'll see more. But it could depend on the intensity of the fire and other factors such as that.
Yeah, I think partially that might have been because a lot of ecosites that we went to were quite wet. I guess after 4 years, and see if any of that changed, and if we can see what you are seeing, the increased recovery after the fire.
Yeah, if it's a very wet ecosite, particularly on the seismic line, then you definitely won't see as much regeneration.
Yeah, that's what we are concluding. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, Angelo. Other questions, comments?
Julia, it looks like you have a hand up at least from Carolyn Campbell.
Yes, you are right. Carolyn, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, thank you. Um, I guess thanks to all the presenters and for this time. I guess a broader question is about the integration of BERA research across teams. So sorry if I didn't quite catch it, but there seems some really interesting, but perhaps somewhat different findings about, from the peatland soil hydrology team about carbon cycling concerns, and possibly the vegetation and some of the habitat findings. And then another integration would be some of the advances and importance of remote sensing versus, say, the importance in the Canada warbler research about field work and really localized impacts that landscape level can't pick up. So just a question about how those kinds of research issues will be integrated for public and decision makers to know about.
Good question, Caroline. Who would like
great,
to take this?
great question.
This is a BERA 2 thing. Greg, are you going to take this?
Well, I'll give it a shot, and then I'll invite my colleagues to help out. I mean, your comment is bang on, Carolyn. Is that we're often talking about different functional effects, and as researchers working primarily in our own labs, we tend to be a little bit siloed about what our effect is compared to what other effects are. I think this is the value of a project like BERA, is that we can actually work together on these things. But the way I think projects like this typically roll out is it tends to be the more individual effects first, and then we try and sort of cross-pollinate and do more conversion objectives, as the experiments or as the project matures. So, I mean, I didn't have time to describe BERA 2 very well, but in BERA 2, I mean, this is precisely what we're proposing, is that, we want to spend a lot more time looking at complex feedback loops and like bringing climate change into the mix, because this is another big external forcing variable that we right now are not even, considering in our models. The other thing that I'll say that we're trying to do in terms of getting our research out there is taking these models and research results and turning them into, planning tools. So you saw an example of a couple of planning tools presented, but I think we're going to, really continue to dig in on that and make sure that these tools we present continue to have sort of, new modules associated with them, new models associated with them, and will, really become more of a state and transition model type of approach where there's sort of multiple interacting factors and multiple decision points. And anyway, I mean, we acknowledge that this is where we need to go next. And
the only thing I would add is, of course, we're trying to be really brief in each of our presentations, and some projects are very extensive in scope as far as scale, like trying to be like the entire Lower Athabasca, and others are very intense. And some of our intense sites, we all overlapped at the exact same place. So the Kirby experiment, for instance, had pretty much every investigator working on with each of the individual components. So it was very integrated. So it kind of depended on projects, but there was, as compared to some other studies, I'd say there still already was a fair amount of integration between labs.
Yeah. Didn't come across that way in this brief overview, I'm sure.
The only other thing I guess I would add is, like, some of what we do in BERA is about, developing approaches that then allow for, that broader scale landscape perspective. We provided the tools that allow that to be done. I mean, our job is not fully to make it operational for all of northeastern Alberta. We simply don't have the resources to do that, but we do have the ability to advance. And this is where I think we make our biggest leaps forward. We demonstrate that this is a new issue or a new concern or a new way of doing things that would improve the capacity of those who are charged with, an ABMI, a government of Alberta, et cetera, to be able to bring that together. And that's where, the standardization of data sets has been a big part of BERA, things like Wild Tracks and other portals that Scott's worked on for plants, for example, where all the data gets used again. right? And it keeps building and building and building, so that at some point, you know, we can always increase that capacity to include these new findings in that broader scale planning.
And I guess the last thing I'll say, and you'd invite, you know, other stakeholders to jump in here, because this was a question, I think, not only for researchers, but really, you know, everyone who's trying to manage this landscape and learn about it. But this is where a project where we have the opportunity to work with, you know, industrial stakeholders, and with BERA too, other stakeholders besides industry, really is a huge advantage. I mean, you know, having, you know, Maria send a student into the field with Synovus and do, you know, on the ground side-by-side comparisons of active treatments. I mean, these are huge things, and they really allow us to sort of translate knowledge into practice and incremental learning on treatment, you know, in a much more powerful way than, you know, traditional research.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Greg, there's one question I'm gonna pick on you, because monitoring is sort of, anyways, the question is, what is the monitoring frequency planned going forward for the study? So I assume that that's monitoring with imagery, but maybe also, because I believe, or maybe everybody can answer that question for their own teams. But Greg, maybe you can go first. What are you envisioning for future studies? At what frequency you want to monitor?
Yeah, well, it's I don't know exactly what is meant by monitoring. I mean, my first response is that we don't do monitoring. I mean, we do research. So if in terms you mean monitoring by, you know, reflying, remeasuring things in order to learn new, that's kind of what we do. So for sure, I mean, one of the things I wasn't able to describe in my overview is one of our guiding research questions, at least in my group, is what's our capacity to detect change over time? And you'll note that I didn't present any of that work today, partly because we were focusing on other things, and partly because we need time for things to change for us to go back and assess our capacity to do that. So I think that this is why, another one of the reasons why we want a BERA 2, because we want to continue on with our experiments in places like Kirby, where we've got all the teams working together. We've made measurements, we've acquired imagery, and now 5 years has passed. We want to, you know, remake those measurements and ask really a whole new series of questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Other comments? Anything different that we haven't yet touched on?
Well, I have one other kind of general question, if I may. So it's Carolyn from AWA. Would it be fair to say that a conclusion perhaps of this research would be to avoid new seismic-related disturbance that involves machinery and compaction, and move towards the kind of lower impact, some call it zero impact, where there's really no equipment and cuts. You know, I know there's cost benefits, but would that be a fair overall conclusion, that it's pretty tough to put back these linear features once they're created?
Well,
I think that's a bit, Carolyn, I think it's a bit of an overstatement. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors. I'm going to I'll let Scott probably speak more to the lowlands and the others. But I mean, the uplands, for example, you know, my experience, honestly, up in northeastern Alberta is when you get into the aspens and the mixed woods, I mean, a major issue actually still remains, and it maybe didn't come across in my speaking about the Canada warbler, but a lot of the lines that those birds don't like, they would have grown a long time ago if people would stay off of them. So people management remains still an issue, I think. So from the perspective of you make a line, maybe people will use it, that's a fair statement, and not creating it in the first place minimizes that. I think the lower impact lines are way less likely to get used for things like ATVs and off-road vehicles. But you know, some of these older conventional ones, you know, have almost become part of local folklore, and they're part of the network of things that people use. And so, you know, I think that remains part of, you know, how much access do we want to allow into the bush, and how do we manage it going forward. So, I mean, a lot of these things, yes, heavier equipment is harder on the soil. It makes it harder to recover. The lower impact seismic, you know, the 2 meter, 2.5 meter wide stuff, if we don't get a lot of human activity on it after in the uplands, it's growing back quite quickly, and the birds are reacting, you know, I think favorably, which is a good thing. It's not to say that there isn't still some impact and it's going to take some time to recover, but it's much faster than that conventional old stuff for sure, which has a human management element as well. So obviously, anything that can be done to minimize grading in the first place is going to reduce the potential impact. There's no doubt about that. I think it's, the question is that cost benefit trade-off, and where is it best used? And I think, you know, when we've highlighted some of the things that just aren't coming back, that's maybe the place where that greater investment of resources using the zero impact approaches might be more appropriate in a cost benefit trade-off.
Yeah, thanks. Scott, did you want to add anything on lowlands?
Well, I mean, I was going to say the same thing as Aaron is, you know, the human activity is just such a big issue that, you know, those are the places that tended to not be coming back, especially, of course, those older lines that tended to also be heavier equipment. In the lowlands, I mean, yeah, obviously where you get that depth of water pretty high, I mean, any of those places is going to be problematic. But my understanding is, although the zero impact kind of seismic line technology, my understanding is it isn't quite, yeah, it's being experimented, but I don't believe it's at the point where it's operational. And others from, you know, Michael Cody or Robert or others who probably comment on that. My understanding is, yeah, it's being explored, and in the long-term future, it's probably, I don't know if it will move towards that, but those things are being considered, which maybe if there's higher costs, you wouldn't think so because you're not cutting trees, but at the same point, there's apparently a lot more cost on the computing side of things. Maybe there could be prioritization where it's done in places that are more sensitive. So yeah, I don't know. It is an interesting discussion, and I think it's early days with that technology, is my understanding.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I don't see any hand raised right now.
Follow up on the
yeah, Robert.
So it's something that, you know, the move to zero impact or lower than low impact seismic is definitely something we're working on. But it's not so much cost as it is safety. Of putting people out in the forest on their own without reliable ways to get people out should something happen. So that's a big consideration that's really at the forefront of this discussion. How can we do it, not only have a lighter touch on the landscape, but also maintain that worker safety is a key consideration for this zero footprint exploration. So there is an effort ongoing at COSIA, that challenge that we put out to the world, and there's work in a series of workshops that are ongoing. So it's moving forward. We're definitely looking at it, Caroline.
Thank you.
Great to know. Yeah, and I think really to add to this whole thing, I mean, I think the goal of BERA is more to look into the restoration of existing, you know, of existing lines and learning what kind of management procedures can be applied, what works, what doesn't work, in a nutshell, like down the road, you know, like to try and get things back to a state where forest cover is accomplished again.
Hey, Julia, it's Michael. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Welcome, Michael. Sorry that you couldn't join earlier. So
yeah, I'm sorry. I missed some of the beginning, but I'm somewhat familiar with it. But one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is that, you know, we can certainly focus on the line itself, and we find certain things, and, you know, for sure we know that some of the things we do in order to grow trees have other unanticipated consequences or undesirable consequences and all of that. But, you know, the context of the landscape, that disturbance is somewhere less than 1% of the landscape. But if we look at the functional disturbance for caribou, you know, the way that we've agreed to describe that is with a 500-meter buffer, et cetera, and under those terms, then the landscape is highly disturbed. And so I just wonder if we're focusing on the right problems sometimes, and whether or not in BERA 2 we can do more work on wolf movement on lines.
On wolf movement, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. Aaron, do you want to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, I mean, part of the reason BERA 2 specifically is there's lots of other programs directly tied into caribou and the caribou monitoring unit that have, you know, wolf type of approaches. One of the things I guess I would say that, you know, we've been working on, I can give an ARU answer and I can give a camera answer. I mean, one of the things that does exist is we've been trying to put together, much like we've done with all the bird point counts, we're trying to get all of the users of cameras in the oil sands region to contribute them to one big database so that we could actually start to bring together multiple groups that have been working on that type of issue to perhaps create some more generalized things. So I think that's certainly a direction that would be nice to support in something like BERA 2, because we can make these links to the detailed vegetation, et cetera, that are going on. At the same time, you know, the ARUs actually are a more cost-efficient way, and they're much more rapid and effective at detecting wolf abundance. So not so much their movement, but how is the numerical type of response, where they're spending time, broadly getting at an idea of the risk to caribou that we don't really have. ARUs more or less can do wolf howls in about 1/10 of the time that it takes to get a wolf hit by a camera. So that's, you know, there's some options to explore within that realm that could automate that process as well. So.
But my understanding is one of the issues is some of the experimental areas that have had treatments, the province has done wolf removals or controls. Makes it very difficult to test the experiment, the effectiveness of the experiment when the wolves are removed. So but yeah, I mean, that's a big issue.
Yeah, I agree. And it's confounded by problems of scale as well, and intensity of treatment and all kinds of things. But maybe that's an opportunity within a big collaborative project with this kind of geospatial technology, et cetera, and intellectual power to maybe really get at that. Because we certainly can't answer it at the site level alone. And it's complicated to answer it at the landscape level as well. But maybe in BERA 2, we can begin to get at that.
I have a thought for synthesis in terms of putting together some of what I've heard. It might be, and kind of following up on Carolyn's question on integration and synthesis. It would be nice to see kind of an integration paper or research note that would be a synthesis piece that would talk about the different impacts that were examined by the project and looking at severity of the impact on the landscape by different metrics. So I heard about tree recovery, carbon accumulation, bird occupancy as different metrics that were used to look at the impactedness. Also different ecosystem classes. Are there different ecosystem classes that are more severely impacted by different disturbance types? And what's the information that we have about that now following up on the project? And are there different co-variables on the landscape that also affect the impactedness? That just comes to mind. And then looking at the recovery side, what can we say about the treatments that are applied? Are those addressing the high impact areas, or are there still gaps that remain after the treatments are applied? What do we know about that now? Just a thought on maybe integration and synthesis and what we've heard today. Could be pretty powerful.
Yes, which all of that is our BERA 2 undertaking. So we will see how, if maybe this needs to be the first thing we start working on, but that's definitely our goal, Daniel. But yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of information here.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible what you guys have already done. So it just seems like a nice, there could be an opportunity now for a nice synthesis piece on that before you move into stage 2. And that could help inform the direction you take in stage 2 as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. Any other responses to this? Maria, Scott, Aaron?
Sure, Danielle, you want to write it? No, I'm joking.
I'm always keen on the integration pieces. So,
I know.
I would be thrilled to jump in, but you guys have done. You guys are the experts on all this work you've already done. So
I know, fair enough.
Just throw out the idea.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's always was planned, and difficult to achieve. But it has been talked about a lot. So.
I don't know. Even a simple summary table might kickstart it, and the rest would probably fall in pretty quickly. But I mean, you guys, I'm already imagining some kind of like summary table with, yeah, impacts, and then on the recovery side seem to be 2 key themes, and then all the different, like some kind of metric-based thing based on all your different different attributes that were measured on the landscape by class. Anyway, throw it out there. I'd love to see it.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots to say about that. I mean, I guess that's why we're all sort of hesitating. I mean, you know, Scott's observation that that's really maybe the hardest thing to do, and everyone is pressed for time is certainly one thing. I think we also need to admit that, you know, translating what we do and synthesizing it and making it available to stakeholders is also something that we're not that great at. We're being better. I mean, and you know, some of us are better than others for sure. I think that Julia's comment that this is one of the things that we want to get better at in BERA 2 still stands. Working with people who are, you know, professional science communicators, you know, finding the time to write those synthesis pieces, making, you know, the one-pagers digestible, and using metrics that are broadly transferable. I mean, these are all things that, you know, are on our list. So I think that all that I can say is that, you know, stand by. We're trying.
There's a reason we call it BERA 1 and BERA 2. So, but I mean, this is exactly what we're now at that phase. I think we've really built a beautiful foundation, which is what we can see in these. I mean, it's delightful for me, for all of us, I think, to see all of the components coming together and starting to see these broad patterns. But absolutely, the next step, Carolyn, you know, button up, you know, right on. I mean, we've been starting to work together, you know, like Maria and Scott are starting now to engage more on the soil compaction and the vegetation responses, right? And of course, exactly, Aaron and Greg are starting to engage more on these bird models. So we are starting exactly now and finally getting at that synthesis integration phase. So we're very excited to hopefully be able to continue this and bring it to that next level, and where we can then come up with a larger atlas of insights, which has also been the kind of terminology we have been using, you know, atlas of data, products, as well as insights gained, metrics. So, but yes, so I'm glad to hear that there's interest, appetite for this, because these are the things that we are endeavoring, you know, to take on in the next phase. So, yeah. So it is 11:40. I mean, we can keep this channel open for a few more minutes, but I just want to call out anybody who now maybe has not had a chance to say anything. Would you like to step forward before we start to slowly close? Oh, I see something here. I see a comment. Oh, let me see.
Be kind, be calm, and be safe.
Oh, I just got two. Yes. Oh, the whole list here is to everybody. Yes. Be kind, be calm, be safe. Yes. Thank you, Robert. There is one here. Okay, I do. So some still post to me, some post to everybody. So there's one comment here. Is there an intention to take advantage of the new dollars from the province? What? There's new dollars from the province and federal government to restore, oh, okay, orphan wells and other disturbances to monitor restoration effects before and after restoration.
I guess I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, there's been conversations about it that I've had a little bit on some of the technology side, as well as building a data locations for storing a lot of the wildlife kind of data. It's early days, but those conversations have been happening with groups like PTAC, OPERF, and COSIA as well. So keep tuned, I guess, from the wildlife side of things.
Yes, thank you, Erin. So another comment, great presentations. Thank you for your flexibility in enabling this to happen, given the circumstances. Well, and look forward to BERA too. Yes, thank you, us too. And we are also really appreciative that you could join under these circumstances. There is one more question or comment. If I may read it, great workshop, helpful information was shared today. I will for sure use some of the products like the Forest Line Mapper, which was introduced today, and learn more about the BERA work. And of course, yes, support for getting a synthesis report paper in the future. So yes, we are getting the messages repeated. Thank you very much. And I'm glad to see that people are excited about the Forest Line Mapper. So any last comments that you want to jump up and rather than putting it to the chat, say it? No, then I think I will then start closing this down, the webinar. So thank you all for joining today. If you have any questions, comments that you couldn't raise right now, please feel free to email myself or of course any of the principal investigators. We look forward to hearing from you more. Yeah, and
the one comment I'd make is, you know, with the shortened format, as explained, we went with just the co-investigators giving the brief overview. So unfortunately, the students weren't able to present, but hopefully we highlighted their work. And a lot of them are on right now, and just a word of thanks for them doing all that work and us speaking for them, unfortunately. But feel free to contact us through Julia or others to directly talk to the students and their projects. It'd be great.
Absolutely. Big thank you to all of our students and postdocs and technicians. Without them, we couldn't do the work we do. Absolutely. Okay, then I will slowly say goodbye and wish you all a wonderful day. And until hopefully the next workshop.